Welcome to the Start to Finish Podcasting podcast, where we talk about everything podcasting. Audio recording, microphones, recording software, helpful podcasting tips, and much more. We help you create and improve your podcast, whether you're new to podcasting or an experienced professional. And now, your host, the man who wakes up every morning with podcasting on his mind, Andre Lewis.
Oh my God.
Welcome to the Start to Finish Podcasting TV network. And today I'm going to talk about something in reference to iTunes. But before I go into anything, I want to let you know that, my neighbor's outside making a deck, and you'll hear some sewing machines, some machines like he has a saw and got a hammer and he's banging nails and all of that. So I apologize if you do hear that. I have the stuff to take that stuff out, but I don't feel like doing that today, man. I don't feel like being an audio snob today. I just want to get this video out, and I just want you to get this information. So we can go into it. But before we do that, I want to give a big shout out to my subscribers, Thomas Armstrong, Tony. I think the number was 101. 2010. Tony, what's up? I remember it. See, who else was it? Baked and Awake, S. Todd Music, Chantel Daniel, and Paul Westlake. So all you guys, thank you for subscribing, man. I and women. I hope you like the channel. I hope you get all the information that you can get from it. I'm going to be start doing more videos. I've been so lazy, man. I've just been lazy. Everything going on with this COVID-19. I apologize, but I'm here now. So I figure I'd get this video in. This ain't a long video. I just want to address an issue that that's been on my mind for a couple of weeks. But it's about iTunes. You call it Apple Podcasts. I'm calling it iTunes. I'm whatever, either way, you know what I'm talking about. So it's not the end all be all. Okay. iTunes is it's okay. It's okay. It's very popular. But what I want to say is that when I first started podcasting, and I'm sure everybody goes through this, when I first started podcasting, all the equipment that I wanted was equipment that all the other podcasters had, like the well-known podcasters, like the big podcast names. So they, at the time, I think it was Ohio PR 40. So I wanted that. I wanted to get that, and it kind of validated like I'm a podcaster, and that's how I felt. Rather, it doesn't validate you, but that's how I felt. So it kind of validated me as a real podcaster to get what they had. There was other things like what else did they have? I would say specific audio interfaces like the Zoom H4 back then. No, it was something more than that. I think it was the Zoom something, but it came way before the Zoom H4. But all of this stuff that these podcasters were using, the well-named and well-notarized podcasters, I wanted to get that, and it made me feel like I had a sense of validation. And a lot of podcasters, new podcasters, feel that way now. Some, you don't even have to be new. Some of them who have been podcasting for about a year or two, or maybe 3, they want to be validated. They want to do what everybody else does, and I strongly discourage you from doing that. Don't do what everybody else does. Do you. Now, if what you do happens to be what everybody else does, then that's fine. But don't go do it because well-known podcasters do it. Don't do it because I do it. Don't do it because everybody's doing it. That's not good. With that, you're gonna end up disappointed or broke, or disappointed and broke, because you're gonna chase all of this stuff, all this gear, and just because the other podcasters use it, and it's not going to do you the same justice as it would do somebody else, because everybody's podcasting gear is different. for different uses. So don't go chasing that. So I say that to say, um, I hear a lot of podcasts about iTunes. You call it Apple Podcasts, iTunes, whatever it may be. And everybody seems to, especially the new ones. I mean, the new ones, they seem to, say, "Oh, I got to get my podcast in Apple Podcasts. I got to get my podcast in iTunes. I got to get it in there. I got to get it in there." And it's great to get it in there. I don't have a problem with it. Mine is in there now, so I don't have a problem with it. It's nothing bad about Apple Podcasts, iTunes, whatever you want to call it. It's just that it's not the end all be all. Like you don't have to have your podcast in Apple Podcasts or iTunes. You really don't. You really don't. A lot of podcasters, even the big ones, the big name ones, they'll tell you get your podcast in Apple Podcasts, get your podcast in iTunes or whatever it may be. But you don't have to do that. Like you don't have to. You don't have to. There's so many different platforms that your podcast can go on as opposed to just iTunes. You have Stitcher, you have iHeartRadio, which I think is more popular than iTunes. Just my opinion in terms of what I'd rather use. I ain't talking statistical numbers because that may vary. But there's Spotify. I'm not a big fan of Spotify either, but you got Spotify. You have SoundCloud, which a lot of people don't use SoundCloud. I love it. I have a few episodes on there. I don't pay for it, so I get up to 3 hours. You can't get up to 3 hours for free. I don't pay for it, but I like SoundCloud because it's very simple. It takes an RSS feed. So if you have an RSS feed, an RSS feed is basically, it's just like somebody giving directions. The person that's giving directions, they'll tell you where your podcast is and point them in the right direction and take you where it's at. So, SoundCloud has an RSS feed. I guess it's a reader or whatever within SoundCloud. So if you submit your RSS feed to SoundCloud, or you can just upload it yourself, it will go to SoundCloud. It's very simple, very easy, accessible. You just click the play and it works great. So you have that. And then you got all these other applications, phone applications. What is it? We got Podcast Addict, which is one of my favorite. You have there's a couple other ones that I use. I don't want to name all of them, but there's quite a few you can use like on an app, and you have all of those avenues of putting your podcast on. You don't have to have your podcast in Apple Podcasts, Apple or iTunes. I keep saying Apple iTunes. You don't have to have it in Apple Podcasts. You don't have to have it in iTunes just for your podcast to be successful. So don't go thinking that my podcast has to be in iTunes for me to be a great podcast or to have my podcast heard. And to be honest with you, I at some point, sometimes I think if you only have your podcast in iTunes, it's a disadvantage because yeah, it's great. Everybody who has an iPhone can get your podcast. It can download automatically and all of that stuff. But those with Androids, I have an Android. I can't, it's just not that easy to get your podcast out of iTunes. Maybe some have changed. I haven't tried it in a long time. But if you have your podcast in iTunes and iTunes only, Apple Podcasts only, people with Android phones, it might be a tough way to not impossible to get to, but it won't be as easy as if you just have it in Podcast Addict. You can download the Podcast Addict app and then search for your podcast, and there it is right there at your convenience right there. So Apple Podcast is not, it's not all of that. And I'm not down in Apple Podcasts, and I don't want this to seem like I'm down in Apple Podcasts, but it's not all of that. You could be successful without using Apple Podcasts. It's I have it in there, like I said, but don't go crazy. Don't go crazy saying, oh, you got to get it. You got to get it. Oh, I got to get this. You don't have to. So there's other avenues that you can use. So I just wanted everybody to know that. Um, and what else? I think a lot of people also, one more thing. I think a lot of people want to get it in Apple Podcasts because they want the new and noteworthy. I'm not too big. I'm not a big fan of that either. I mean, people are going crazy over this new and noteworthy. Look, it'll help you a little bit, but if you got some good stuff and your podcast is good and you're talking about something that people want to hear, you'll be fine. New and noteworthy. It's overrated. It's very, very overrated. Just like Apple Podcasts, it's very overrated. People just chase Apple Podcasts like, oh, I gotta have this, I gotta have that. But trust me, it's not. It's nothing to write home about. You know. So just remember that for my new podcasters. When you start your podcast, don't go crazy on it. Don't go crazy thinking you got to get Apple Podcasts, get your podcast there. There's other avenues. If you need to know how to get on those other avenues, you can email me at starttofinishpodcasting@gmail.com. That's starttofinishpodcasting@gmail.com. You can also go to my website. That's starttofinishpodcasting.com. And there's a lot of information on there. I got a lot of videos. I have a Patreon page. Also, you can check that out. You can get to that by going to the website, starttofinishpodcasting.com, and it'll give you a link to my Patreon page. If you want to donate all the money that I get from my Patreon page or any donations, I put it right back into this. I don't use it to spend on myself or anything. Everything that I get from this goes back into podcasting, whether if it's simple things like getting extra mic or doing a review or getting better equipment to do these videos. It all goes back in. So if you can make a donation, great. If you can't, I'll catch you next time. But that's going to be it. I just wanted to, let you know that you don't have to do what everybody else does, and you sure don't have to have your podcast in Apple Podcasts because you'll still get heard if your content is good. All right. So this is Andre Lewis signing off. I want to thank you for tuning in. I want to thank Thomas, Tony, Baked and Awake, S. Todd, Chantel, and Paul. So that's my newest subscribers. Hey, if you got any questions, reach out to me. I'll be glad to answer them, you guys. Starttofinishpodcasting@gmail.com. Thank you and keep podcasting. I am out of here.
Thank you for listening to the Start to Finish Podcasting podcast at www.starttofinishpodcasting.com. Don't forget, you can listen to the Start to Finish Podcasting podcast in iTunes, Stitcher, and SoundCloud. You can also visit our social media pages on Twitter, Facebook, and Google+. Thanks for listening.